Closed captioning provided by Duca Financial Services Credit Union. Discover more affordable banking at duca.com.
Our next guest has been called one of the most exciting American science fiction and fantasy writers to emerge in the current decade. He is a former lawyer and newspaper editor. John C. Wright, welcome to Listen Up.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.
Well, terrific. Now, you've had 9 science fiction books, and then at age 42, something dramatic happens in your life. You decide to abandon atheism. You convert to Christianity. Why?
As I got older and was a married man and had children, I began to realize that atheism was not a philosophy, was not a sufficient groundwork for dealing with the real world I had to deal with. It did not answer certain questions I had. It did not seem to form a coherent basis for a moral philosophy, especially for a philosophy that allows you to raise children correctly. And so I read more and more into certain Christian apologists like C.S. Lewis, and particularly G.K. Chesterton, who I hope you've heard of. He's a famous writer from the last century. And these men seemed so witty and wise and solidly grounded in the important things in life. And my fellow atheists seemed so flippant. I don't know a better word for it. Their answers to life's deep questions seemed quite superficial to me. I began to find myself slowly finding that my fellow atheists, I was the only member of my camp, and I marched under the atheist banner, and I wore the uniform, and I did everything else an atheist was supposed to do, weren't thinking like me. They weren't agreeing with me on any of the basic questions.
John, what you attempt then is an experiment in prayer, right?
Because I realized you couldn't philosophically deduce yourself to God, because God wouldn't set up a system that was so difficult to achieve knowledge of Him, I decided to experiment and pray. And so what I said is, Dear God, I know you don't exist. I know philosophically, and I know with as much certainty as a man who knows twice 2 is 4, that you cannot possibly exist. But if I'm wrong, because as a philosopher you have to recognize you might be mistaken about your conclusions, but if I'm wrong, I dare you, I challenge you to show yourself to me. I demand it, in fact, because if you don't, either you don't exist, which is what I suspect, or you do exist and you don't care if I'm damned, in which case you're not benevolent, in which case you're hardly a God at all. Well, God not only answers prayers, He has a sense of humor, because I had a heart attack and was sent to the hospital two days after I prayed that prayer. In the hospital, I had a vision of the Virgin Mary and several other visions, which I'm not at liberty to speak about in any detail. And my heart attack was cured by prayer, and I also had a religious experience about a week later that was different from the original visions, and I was just drenched with a superfluity of evidence, an abundance of evidence.
There are philosophers, there are explorers who ask God for evidence and they don't get any. What would you say about the experience for God, with God, then? The truth of God?
You mean if someone prays a prayer like mine and doesn't get an answer?
Yep.
There's 2 answers to that. One is God knows, not me. The second answer is I have talked to other atheists and it's merely described my experience to them, and they, a priori, without looking at the evidence, dismissed the evidence as even possible. A person whose heart was not prepared would probably not have that prayer answered.
And where do you advise we go to learn what's happening between people and God?
First, kneel and pray. Second, read the Bible. Third, read history books. Look at the tradition of the church. Reason. Use your reason. God has given you a faculty of logic by which you can deduce certain truths by correct premises. And if your premises are correct, your conclusions will be correct also.
John C. Wright, author of The Null A Continuum, The Golden Age, and Orphans of Chaos, thank you for being with us.
You're quite welcome, and thank you for having me.
And now this.
People have always been interested in the future, and it seems to me that science fiction is a way of thinking about the future, not just intellectually, but emotionally and dramatically. And I think that's especially valuable now when the future is beginning to look a little uncertain.
Our next guest is a scientist who holds over 100 U.S. patents. His latest invention allows paper to self-erase after a day, and he still has enough imagination left over to write science fiction. Author of The Halcyon Dislocation, Dr. Peter Casimir, welcome to Listen Up.
Thanks, Lorna. It's a pleasure and a privilege.
Oh, well, great to have you. Now, listen, your novel is about 2 parallel worlds existing in different time quanta. What makes that different than other science fiction approaches?
Well, Lorna, I think in some ways I'm trying to fit into the genre of other science fiction stories, in the sense that I want to have a plot-driven novel that has a lot of scientific content in it. But on the other hand, I would also like to have in that novel some great conversations, you know, things that deal with the big questions like, is there a God? You know, how does evil happen, and why is there evil? How do we relate to the universe, and is there design, or is everything just happening by chance?
Okay, so we've been hearing this all show long, that this is the genre, science fiction is the genre, to wrestle through those big spiritual questions. What is there about that kind of fantasy in science fiction that can bridge us over into spiritual truths?
Well, I think part of it is the fact that science fiction and fantasy, more than other genres, really give scope to the author to design the environment for the plot and also for the characters. So in the case of my particular novel, it's based on a catastrophe that moves this island university into a parallel world. Well, often catastrophes, as we've seen in our own world, brings up the big questions, and people start to ask questions about, you know, why does this evil happen, as we saw in 9/11. And they ask about whether God was present when this happened, and how do we get back? Is there redemption for us? Can we be saved from our present circumstance? And all of those questions come up when a catastrophe happens. And I think science fiction and fantasy have the possibility of setting that kind of a stage.
Okay, and you want to spark people's imagination about those tougher questions of life that we might just race over. You're hoping your novel will stop us on the big questions about God. Why?
Well, I think they're really important questions, but as a novelist, one really has to handle that very delicately. Because on the one hand, when I read books, I very much dislike it when novelists start to manipulate my thinking. And they set the stage and they maneuver the characters in such a way that I'm forced to reach a particular conclusion. What I would like to do is I would like to raise the questions in a genuine way. I'd like to have the characters actually discuss it from different points of view in an honest way. And of course, I will have my own perspective on it, but I don't want it to dominate the discussion to such an extent that the reader feels manipulated.
Does science fiction help me understand that the human race is separated from God, that sin has made a break between us and God?
I think it has the potential to do it. Most science fiction doesn't, because it's written from a materialistic perspective. And so it enters into the story with a worldview perspective, often that we're the result of an accident, that our thinking is the result of complex chemical processes going on. And that kind of perspective almost precludes the discussion about whether there is a God or whether he's impacting our lives.
All right, so here you are, obviously looking for source material to influence all kinds of interesting realms in your own life. Scientist, science fiction writer, and then all the other roles that you have. What difference has it made being a Christian?
Well, I haven't always been a Christian, but when I became one, I think it became the lens which kind of brought the whole world into focus for me. So when I'm doing science, I see the fingerprints of God over the things that I study. It helps me understand relationships. It helps me understand the way I am. I think it solves the problem of evil for me in a very legitimate and real way.
Dr. Peter Casimir, author of The Halcyon Dislocation. Thank you very much for being with Listen Up.
Thank you.
And when we return, I'll share my thoughts about humanity's quest for God through science fiction in The Rat.